Now we're going to talk about the difference between authentication and authorization. The basic idea is that authentication is a way of verifying who you are. An example might be an email and a password, or it might be doing a Google login using your Google credentials, or GitHub, or Facebook, or Apple, so on. And then authorization is verifying what you can do. Now that we know who you are, what are you allowed to do? So who are you? What can you do? That's authentication versus authorization. We're going to start out by talking about authentication and how to do that with React. For authentication, what we can do in React is we can use a hook. There are a few hooks to use. One is you need to get the authorization state. That is, you need to know what the state is of the authorization, whether they're logged in, who the user is, information about the user, like their email, and so on. That will have required some sort of a login and authorization in the past, but it may continue to be valid. So, for example, if I go to Sakai and log in, then even if I close that window and come back into Sakai, I still should be logged in for some amount of time. What we can do is use the use auth state hook. So we have a hook, and what we have is a use auth state hook. The use auth state hook we initialize with our authorization object. We can get that as a global, just like we get the database. We can say auth equals firebase dot auth. This then is going to return us, as hooks do, three things: user, loading, and error. What will happen is, to begin with, we'll get in loading Boolean, specifying that we're still loading. That is, it's actually going to the network and do a check. And then when it comes back, we'll get either a user or not a user. So we will get a user. User is going to be valid if we're logged in. And user is going to be invalid. I don't remember whether it's null or undefined if we're not logged in. Okay. And why would we be logged in? Well, we may have already been logged in, right? So we may have logged in recently and we just open a tab and it'll show that we're still logged in. You have some control over that, over how long basically the login lasts. So if you're using a public computer, then you could not have that last. But in any case, this tells us whether we're logged in or not. And if we look at the user, we have things like user.email. We may have user.displayname. If we're logging in via Google, for example, it has a first and last name. We have our email. And what's important as well is we have a user.uid. And this is our unique user ID. We'll normally put this at the top level component. Basically, at the point where we want the user to sign in, we will do a use auth state. And then the use auth state is going to return the user if it's there. And if it's not there, we're going to want to send them to a sign in or sign up page. If the user is there, then we want to go ahead and display our component that assumes that they're signed in. Use auth state, this hook, is going to be reevaluated if the sign in state changes. So if the user actually does sign in, our component will be called again, as commonly happens with hooks. And this time the use auth state is going to return a valid user. Let's look at actually doing a sign in. This will normally be in some sort of a sign in page. We're going to then use a hook for this again. Now, the Firebase authentication has an API. We just have a wrapper around it with the React hooks. We have a hook, which is fairly long. It's use, sign in with email and password. We pass in our auth. That returns us now a const array with 4 items in it. Those 4 items, again, loading is because it's going to the network. Well, let's just back up a second. to begin with, when this comes back, user credential will be invalid and loading is going to be false. So we're not loading, nothing's going on. So we don't have a user credential, loading is false, we don't have an error, and sign in with email and password is a function that we can use to do signing in. So somewhere down here, we'll probably have a button, and on click, we're going to go ahead and sign in with email and password. And guess what parameters you need to pass? An email and a password. The email and password presumably is going to come from a text field that the user types into. So as is standard, we will have a text field for email. The on click on that is going to go ahead and update some state information, and then the email and password in that state information. So presumably there's a set email and a set password, and we have on inputs for both of those. Sign in with email and password, then goes ahead and executes, and that's going to cause our hook to reevaluate. So it's going to cause our sign in page component to reevaluate. Use sign in with email and password is then going to return loading of true. Let's look at the life cycle of this. Use sign in, I'm going to just say with email password. What comes back? We get loading is false. We don't get an error. And we get the user credential, which is invalid. And we also get a sign in with email and password function. So this is a function. We call that function, and that's going to cause our hook to reevaluate. So the next time you sign in with email and password is going to get called, and it's going to return the same sign in function. Loading is now going to be true. We won't have a user credential, and we won't have an error. And then our sign in is going to complete either successfully or unsuccessfully. Let's look at the valid sign in case. In the valid sign in case, we're going to have use sign in. Our hook is going to return loading of false. It's going to return the same sign in function. It's going to return a user credential, which is valid, and it's going to return none error. The user credential has within it the .user object that we saw before that is an email and a display name and a UID and so on. But the key thing to note here is that although this hook is reevaluating and we're getting this user credential valid, our parent's hook, our main application, is also getting reevaluated because we're out here, right? This is, let's say, in top level component. It's getting reevaluated because the authorization state has changed. So now all of a sudden use auth state, before it returned an invalid user, now it's going to return a valid user. This top level code only displays the login screen if we don't have a valid user. As soon as the user successfully logs in, we'll be done with the sign-in page, and we'll just come back to here, and then we'll go ahead and display the rest of our application. Now, the third case is we have an invalid sign-in. Again, the sequence of events is we called the use sign-in with email and password. It returned us a sign-in function. We called that sign-in function at some point once the user entered in their email and password. And then that's going to reevaluate the use sign-in with email and password, and that's going to return to loading of true. And now, assuming it was an invalid username and password, now we're going to evaluate use sign-in with email and password a third time. And now we're going to get, again, our sign-in function. We're going to get a loading of false. We're going to get a user credential, which is invalid. And we're going to get an error with probably something going to be invalid username password. And by the way, when I say username, it's really email, right? So invalid email and password. Here, this hook, use auth state, is not going to be reevaluated. Use auth state is not going to be reevaluated because the state of authorization hasn't changed. We weren't logged in. We tried to log in and we failed. So it really hasn't changed our authorization. Therefore, we'd probably want to stay in the sign-in page, put some error that said invalid username and password. This is how we sign in with an email and password. Now, the question is, how do you actually create your username and password? You do that with another hook. We have a hook, which is use create user with email and password. And that returns us a similar 4 tuple, well, really 4 array. So we have a function, create user with email and password. And then we also have 3 values getting returned, our user credential, our loading, and our error. The Firebase SDK actually defines a create user with email and password, but it's an asynchronous call. And then you need to go ahead and be waiting on the response to see whether there's an error or whether it succeeds. The hook really makes that much simpler. So you don't have to worry about the asynchronicity. Instead, you just use the hook and you know that the component is going to re-render when either an error or happens or when the creation succeeds. Later on, of course, again, you'll have a button and the on click is going to call create user with email and password. And you'll pass in some email and some password. Again, presumably ones that the user typed. How can that fail? Well, for instance, there may already be an existing username, or maybe the password isn't strong enough. You get that back in the error. But in general, as soon as you call create user with email and password, this hook is going to reevaluate. Your component will be re-rendered. Loading is going to be true. You can put up a small loading screen, and then you can go ahead and wait. And the next time you'll get a user credential or you'll get an error. Same idea with the user credential. That is, when you create the user with email and password, it automatically logs you in with that email and password. So you don't have to go through a separate login step. So that means if you put in a valid email and password, then this hook is going to get evaluated twice, really. So we get evaluated the first time, we get given then this creation function. We call the creation function, and then the second time, we're going to get a loading of true. And then the third time that this would otherwise be called, it's probably not going to be called because we have here our top level component where our use auth state is going to be reevaluated. Our application is actually a component is going to be reevaluated because the login state is different. And that's going to return our user. And then we're not going to show the sign up page. That shows how you can do both signups and sign ins with email and password. Let's look now at how we might do authentication with some separate provider. We'll do a Google login for this. What we do is initialize the same place we're initializing the database and the authorization. We just need to do this one time outside of any component. We could just do a Google provider. So we create a Google provider, and all we really need to do is somewhere in our sign-in page, I will presumably have one button to sign in with an email and password and some other button to sign in with Google. We could basically do a button whose on click is a method on the authorization. And along with that, we pass the provider we want. So we pass the Google provider. Kind of get the idea that there may be other providers supported in R. So this is a function that does that. And this would be something like sign in with Google. And that's really all that happens. The user will go through, they will do their sign in. And then once they successfully do that, then the authorization will change. And again, we'll be back. Use auth state is going to be reevaluated. That is, our application component is going to re-render and we'll get a new value for our use auth state. Let's look at an example of this running. Well, let's first look at going to a particular website and looking at their sign-in. I'm going to sign in, and you can see I have either sign in with Google, and what that would do then is we would go ahead and in response to that, we would call the auth.signin with pop-up of Google provider. Or we have an email and password, and then we can go ahead and click here to sign in. And that is going to just call our sign in with email and password. Let's just try this. And it fails. It's not a valid email. And wrong email or password. So we've gotten the error, and we could display that error. In the sign up, we can enter an email and password, and then this would be the create call, create user with email and password. And here's an example of actually making some calls where we actually have some tabs for sign in and sign up. And here we have a hard-coded email and password. So I can log in with that email and password. That's great. I can also log out. So let's just go back to that in a moment. I can log in with Google. I log out. I can sign up and create a test user. Now, in this particular case, the test user already exists. So we're going to get an error. By the way, if you want to see some of these loading messages, a good way to do it is to go into this mobile responsive and turn on throttle. Let's look at an example. We create test user. It says signing up. So that's the loading message. Because loading was true, we did sign up, and then we've got an error signing up. Here, for example, I log in with a test user. What's going to happen? It's going to say logging in, waiting, because we're doing this throttling. So it's making the network be very slow. Then eventually it works. The last thing to talk about is how to actually log out. In order to log out, you just need to call auth.sign out. That's going to, again, cause your main application's use auth state to be re-evaluated. So your top level component is going to be re-rendered. Use auth state is now going to return a invalid user. That's all there is really to authentication. Next, we're going to talk about authorization.